Welcome back to Real Builds for the second segment on suspension. This time around we're going to talk about wheels and tires. They are as much a part of the suspension as the springs, the shocks, the lower control arms, and they're an important part. They're also a part that people get really confused about it. So I'm going to cover some really basic stuff, but we're going to start with wheels. So let's talk about the wheel itself. The stuff we have to concern ourselves with is the diameter, so from here to here, but not on the outside. Diameter is always measured on the inside lip. So if you measure this wheel, which is a 13-inch TR7, on the outside it measures right about 14¼ inches. But we know it's a 13-inch wheel. So if you measure the inside lip, which is right about 1 inch and 5/8, double it and subtract it from the outside, you'll get 13 inch. So always measure from the inside. Inside, always. Okay? The second part is width. And again, width is not measured on the outside. You do not measure the wheel width here. You measure it on the inside. So on the inside, it's 5½ inches, which we know to be correct because that's a factory wheel from a Triumph TR7. Okay? Next, that's important when selecting wheels or understanding wheels is the bolt pattern. This one's kind of easy because it's a 4-bolt. You measure center to center and you quickly discover it's 3¾ inches. Yeah, it's that tiny, believe it or not. And it also doesn't fit anything else except the odd lotus. But bolt pattern's incredibly important, and there's so many. If you can't measure it properly yourself, because if you get into a 5-bolt or a 7-bolt wheel it can get awkward, you can always look it up and make sure you get the correct bolt pattern. And then there's the center hole. And again, we're always measuring on the inside on this. So on the TR7 here, the inside is just a hair under 2¼ inches diameter in the center hole. Now this is important because it's got to fit over your spindles and axles. So if you don't have the right size center hole, even though the bolt pattern's right, it's not going to fit. And if the center hole is too big, and it's a hub-centered wheel, it's never going to sit perfectly on the hub. So you got to get this stuff right. So, quick repeat, diameter, always measured on the inside to the inside, width, inside to inside, bolt pattern, how it bolts to the wheel, to the hub, and the center hole is also incredibly important. Always measure those things before you start worrying about selecting wheels. The other piece you have to worry about is called backspacing. And backspacing is the difference from the face of where the wheel bolts to the hub to the outer edge. The way you measure that, get a nice straight edge, get it centered and up, take your tape measure, and measure where it hits the flange. Okay, in this case 4¼ inches. This is important because that backspacing dictates how the wheel sits in the wheel tub and the wheel opening. And it all plays in to how big a tire you can fit into any specific wheel well and still have it work without rubbing or hitting. Okay, so that's the important pieces on a wheel. Okay, now let's talk about tires. Tires, we also have a bunch of different things we have to think about. Now, this is one from the rear of the green coupe. I run a 205/50/15 tire on the coupe in the rear. And let's compare that to this tire, which is just a tickle smaller than a 175/7013 that came stock on the TR7, and you can see why getting a good tire underneath makes such a dramatic difference in handling. The more contact patch you have squarely on the ground, the more grip you get. It's really that simple. But let's look at the basics of a tire first. Again, we have to look at what we're dealing with. So, when we talk section width, those first numbers, when you start looking at wheels and tires, so this one is a 165/7013. 165 is not the width of the tread. It is the section width from tire sidewall to tire sidewall. And if you look at a tire from the top, you'll see the sidewall always sticks out a little bit more than the tread. Okay? So it's the section width, not the tread width, the section width. The second thing we always look at is the aspect ratio. And the aspect ratio is this height from the rim to the tread face. This one is a 70, and that means that this height is 70% of the section width. Okay? So, if you want to know exactly what that is, you take 165, because this is a 165/7013. You multiply it by 0.7 to get the 70% height. So that height, and it'll give you in millimeters what that height is. And you can convert to inches by dividing by 25.4. Okay? What's important about the aspect ratio is the higher the aspect ratio, the taller a tire is going to be. So a 165/8013 is going to be a little taller than this tire. A 165/6013 is going to be a little lower. All right? And then again in the designator, 165/7013, 13 is the wheel diameter. Now, these things are important so you can start making selections. All right? And using that information, the 165/7013, those designators, you can do a lot of calculating to determine what the diameter, the width, and what it's going to do to your car. Now, in the case of my green coupe, I went up to a 50 series 205 50/15 tire. It's actually, for all intents and purposes, the same height as a 175/7013 that came stock, because the aspect ratio is only 50% of the section width. Okay? That means this 15-inch tire, because of its low aspect ratio, is the same height as a 13-inch tire, even though it's a 15, because of how it works out. And if you want to work it out for yourself, it's not hard to do. If you take the section width times 2, multiply it by the aspect ratio, that'll give you this height and this height in millimeters. Divide that by 25.4 and it will give you the height in inches. Add 15 and you've got the diameter of the tire. Section width, divide by 25.4 and it'll give you the width of the tire. Okay? Lower aspect ratio means a stiffer sidewall, makes the car more responsive, makes it handle better, and gives it more grip. Unfortunately, it also means as you reduce that section width percentage from, say, 80 series to 75 series to 70 series and then jump down to 50 series, the ride will become more harsh because the sidewall is that much stiffer. So that's something to take into account when you want to start thinking about what kind of tires you want to switch your car to. And that pretty well covers dimensions on tires. Now we're going to look at how to figure out how to get the biggest tire you can underneath your wheel well. So now that you've got a good idea on how wheels are measured up and what those measurements mean, and how tires measure up and what those measurements mean, we're going to use Project Off the Shelf, the Geometro, as an example of how to measure up to see how big a tire and how big a wheel you can get underneath your car. And we're going to start at the back because it's easiest. So while the car is sitting level, this car is sitting on stock 155/80/13 tires. So they're pretty skinny, skinnier than the 165 I showed you, and a little taller. But let's look at what we got to check to see what fits. First thing we're going to check is from the center of the wheel. We want to see how much room we have between the tire sidewall and the inner fender well. So we take something we can use as a straight edge and get it tight on the sidewall, and then we measure to the inner lip of the fender. So in this case, doing that, we discover we've got about 3/4 of an inch that we can play with to the edge of the inside lip, because inside every fender there's a lip, and if you don't want to cut it or modify it, that means you've only got 3/4 of an inch this way to play with the wheels. Now we do the same at the back, which can get really awkward, but same process. You get a straight edge that you can measure against, you get out your tape measure, and at the center top of the wheel you measure to the back. And that's going to give us, let's see here, about 1.5 inches to play with. Then we do the same up front and on the inside, same at the back. And what we discover, because we've already done this car, of course, is we've got 1/2 inch out this way, 1.5 inches to the inner fender well. Now what you need to do, and it's best to do this with a couple of buddies around, is weigh the car down. You got to get the back end as low as you ever expect it to do on a bump. Then you make these measurements again. This particular car, even though the wheel does arc a little bit as it goes up and down, the measurements stay pretty consistent. So we now know that we have 1.5 inches towards the inside, we have 1/2 inch we can come out this way, and that's on all corners. Now, last piece of course is height, and we'll do that with a calculator. We know it's a 155, so the section width is 155 millimeters. It's an 80% aspect ratio and a 13-inch wheel. So we'll do that at the end. But now we're going to go to the front. And the front is more awkward. Now we have to repeat all the measurements we made at the back. Okay? So, straight edge off the sidewall, make sure it's perfectly vertical. And we get, again, right about 1/2 inch. On the inside, I'm going to cheat a little bit because we've already measured it, because we know how big we can go. And especially when you have a strut tower involved, you got to be real accurate. We again have about 1.75 inches to play with. Measuring at the back and the front, we discover the same thing. But here's where it gets a little more complicated. Now you have to turn the wheel all the way to the left and repeat those measurements. because as the wheel arcs through, you've got inner fender well, you've got braces, and all kinds of things in here that it could hit. So once you sweep it through and get it turned all the way to the left, you measure again and see how much room you have. Then repeat the process to the right, and using the same techniques, measure everything again. Then get your buddies over, get the front of the car as low as you can under pressure to what you expect the maximum bump you're going to hit is, or till it bottoms out. Measure all the way again. By doing this, you now know exactly how much room you've got in there to play with. And particularly on the front end of this thing, we can't really go any taller than the stock height, because then we'll start to hit the bottom of the strut support for the spring. So we know our limit on diameter already. But we also know how much room we have through the whole swing, and basically gives us 1 3/4 inches in the back, 1/2 inch out here. Now we can talk about how to figure out how much we can get in there. Okay, so we have all our measurements. Now let's start looking at what we do with them. So the stock wheel and tire that's on there, a 155/80/13, means that right now the tire diameter that we don't want to exceed is 22.76 inches. Might as well call it 22 3/4 of an inch. We don't, we know because it's an 80% aspect, the 155 section width, when you divide by 25.4 equals a 6.1 inch total width. We know it's on a 13-inch wheel, and because we've measured, we know we've got a 4.5 inch backspacing. Now let's see how much we can get away with in terms of putting more wheel and tire underneath it. And to do that, we have to make a few assumptions. Number one, I'm going to assume you're like me and you don't really want to get any closer to that outside fender lip. You're only a 1/2 inch away, which means we've only got about 1 inch or so, inch and 1/4, that we can add tread towards the inside of the car. So let's look at our measurements, let's look at our backspacing and figure out how we can do that. So we do a little math, and what do we come up with? Well, we know we can add up to 1.5 inches or 38 millimeters of section width that we can add. And that would give us a maximum of 195 millimeter section width. We also know, because we've done the measurements, that's where it's important, that we can't really add any diameter. We're kind of stuck at that 22.75, 76, 77 diameter. So now we need to look at what kind of tires are going to fit that mold. We also have to take into account that in order to accept those tires, we're going to need to move to a 6-inch wheel width away from a 5-inch wheel width. So let's take another look at things. What we do know is we can go to a 195 tire. So if we pull out our calculator and start doing some calculating, we can figure out how close we can get. Now, we know, sorry, just trying to get this back in focus. I know by checking the catalogs and going online, when it comes to 195 millimeter tires, in my part of the world, it's pretty limited selection. We've got 195/60/14, we've got 195/60/15, and we've got 195/50/15. Now, we need to figure out the diameters. So let's take a second and look at how we do that. We're going to take and do a little math. 195 times 2 times 0.6 equals as I work it out on my handy dandy calculator built into my telephone, 195 times 2 times 0.6 gives us 234 millimeters. In height. Now we convert that to inches. Which comes to 9.2125 inches. Now we add the rim, so 9.2125 inches. If we're going with the 14-inch wheel, gives us a height of 23.2 inches. If we're going with a 15-inch wheel, it's going to give us 24.2. Now we know we can't go over 22 3/4. So the 195 60/14 and the 195 60/15 aren't going to work. Now we crunch the numbers again with 195/50. So $195 times 2 times 0.5 equals $195, of course. So that's a height of 7.67 inches. And now we add the rim width, 15. And that's going to give us a total diameter of 22.67. Which just comes in with speedometer error to the maximum height that we can more or less get away with. A 1/10 of an inch is not going to make enough of a difference to really affect your speedometer very much. So we know a 195/50/15 tire will fit. The next thing we have to concern ourselves with is backspacing, because we need at least a 6-inch rim to get a 195/50/15 on our rims. So that means we have to look at what we're doing with backspacing. And if you remember, backspacing, this is the rim. Backspacing is the distance here to the mounting point of the wheel to the hub. And we know we have 4.5-inch backspacing on the 13-inch wheel, the stock 13-inch wheel. We also know that we don't have enough clearance to move the wheel outwards when we widen it up. So we have to move it inside, which means we have to increase the backspacing. Now that means instead of a stock 4.5 inch backspace, we now need 15-inch rims with a 5.5 inch backspace. If we want to run 195, 50, 15 tires, which are essentially the largest we can get away with on the Geo Metro without starting to modify the bodywork. Now I hope I've made that pretty simple, and the formulas are right there on how to do it. So to go to the bigger wheels and tires, which we are doing, we can go up to a 195, 50, 15, but I've got to get new 15-inch wheels with a 5.5 inch backspace, and because we've already measured the bolt pattern, we know it's 4 on 4.5 inches, and we just have to make sure the hub size is correct because the Geo is hub centric. So we've got all the data we need now in order to upgrade 1.5 inches in width, keep the same height. We're going to reduce the aspect ratio a whole bunch, which means an already rough ride is going to get rougher on the Geo Metro. But that step in adding that much rubber all the way around the car is going to make a massive difference in how the car handles. Now, you need to do this homework for yourself. You got to be careful with the measurements. You got to double check them and always leave a little bit of a cushion. The one thing with tire manufacturers is the sizing is the ranking, but they've got a little bit of wiggle room. So before you select a specific tire, you want to know its exact measurements and measure them yourself as well. Buying tires can be a bit of a challenge, but when you've done all this kind of homework, you can get the maximum tire that you feel best for your vehicle underneath. Now for you guys restoring a car, this is all interesting information. Doesn't matter, you're going to be keeping the stock wheels and tires anyway. But for anybody who's looking for improvements or customization, this is the stuff you got to think of, and think of how it's going to affect and make sure you have enough clearance. The other thing to think of is there is such thing as too much tire. You get too much diameter, too much width, too heavy a tire and wheel combination on too small a car, it can actually make the vehicle handle worse. So you need to balance it. It's always great to talk to the guys in the tire shop, but have your information first. Now with our TR7, because I've done all these measurements, I've decided to go with a 205/50/15 when the new suspension goes underneath it. My car currently rides on a 185/50/15 in the front and a 205/50/15 in the back. And I did that for some very specific reasons to do with handling characteristics. And we'll talk more about that when we get into more advanced stuff. But I think it's important with tire and wheel selection, you have this basic data, because I see it all the time on Facebook and the internet forums. How much wheel and tire can I fit under my XYZ car? This is how you do it. The other thing is, always do both sides. Especially on older muscle cars, the build quality wasn't the same as we had nowadays, and you can get differences in clearance side to side. I know that sounds odd, but I've seen it on Novas and Camaros, Mustangs, all kinds of different cars. You can get up to 1 inch of difference. So you've got to do both sides, front to rear, just the way we've gone over in this video. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section or send me an email. I always answer everything I get. But now you've got the basic tools to figure out how much you can put underneath. Now, lastly, there's one other thing we need to talk about, and that's speed ratings. Tires come in different speed ratings. The most common ones are S, H, V. Those are the most common. Now for supercars and stuff that's breaking 160, 170 miles an hour and beyond, there are some different speed ratings. But I'm never going to go there, so I haven't studied them. S is pretty much a standard passenger car tire. They're rated to about 85 miles per hour safely. And they also have a real hard compound, so they're very, very good for tread wear. H is considered a touring tire. They're good to about 130 miles per hour by their rating. And they have more of an intermediate tread. Softer than an S rating, but it's not as soft as a V. And if I remember correctly, the V rating is up to about 165 miles an hour. I can't imagine myself having a street car that goes that fast, so double check that information. Also, be very careful on tread wear. The ratings are right in the side of the tire, and you can bug your tire guy, because when you get into H and V, you get selections in how fast you want that tire to wear out. The softer the tire, the more stick you get, but the less life the tire has. So you got to pick what you want. I'll be picking on the H rating for the TR7, a tire that's got mid-range wear, because I'm going to be driving it on the street and commuting and using it in competition. And I don't want to have to buy 2 sets of tires. But if you're only occasionally driving the car, less than 3,000–4,000 miles a year, you can probably go with a real soft rating and get away with it and get a decent few years out of it. Once you get into V, these are expensive tires, they're extremely high performance, and they're soft. And you can get them in varying stages to extremely soft, such as with the Toyo Proxys, which have a very, very low tread wear rating, but I think you could just about climb a wall if you could get a car on with it. So, very important part of the suspension are wheels and tires. These are the basics. I suggest you read up some more on it. Double check my info. And remember, even though you've worked out all the math and you look it up and work it out, always double check tires before you buy them to make sure they don't exceed your maximum limits. And that's about it from Real Builds for today. Now, if you have any questions, put them in the comments section. If I don't have the answer, I'll find out. Or send an email. My email is on the About page. And I'll do my best to fill you in wherever I can. But by following these steps and doing this kind of measuring, both at level height and full rebound, you're going to be clear and you'll have the measurements that'll let you put as much tire underneath as you want. And by understanding the wheel dimensions and back spacing and the hub diameter and bolt pattern, will let you select a wheel to get as much tire on the ground as you want. And that's about it from Real Builds today. If you found this useful, I'd like to know in the comments. If you're enjoying the series, please do like, subscribe, and notify. It's greatly appreciated. So that's it for today from Real Builds. Thanks a bunch.